Early literacy constitutes reading and writing skills that children develop before they're actually reading and writing. So I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, but there are lots of skills that need to be gained and developed before children actually sit down and read words on a page or write words on a page, write some sort of story or sentence. So early childhood is the ideal time to be working on these reading and writing skills, and so that's what this lecture today is going to be about. Early literacy includes attending to both reading and writing skills that children will need as they move forward into the elementary school age years. So once upon a time, there was kind of this old idea that you had to learn to read, so you had to get all those skills figured out first, and then you started working on writing. But we know now through research that reading and writing occur simultaneously. They feed off of each other. They are not independent skills. They are skills that work in conjunction with each other. We also know that, yes, we should hold off on expecting true reading and writing until children are in elementary school, but that these early literacy skills absolutely can be happening in early childhood. So as you noticed on the previous slide, these should be hands-on, play-based activities, drawing, reading, having stories read to you, singing, playing rhyming games. This can happen in the context of child-initiated activities where children are working on materials with minimal adult intervention, maybe some adult scaffolding in conjunction with their friends. And it can also be adult-led activities, so circle times where a story is being read or a song is being sung. But the bottom line is for early literacy that when children are engaging in these activities that get at these reading and writing skills, that everything should be hands-on, experiential, and meaningful to the children's lives. So in the 80s and 90s in particular, we had kind of a reading war going on, and people were quite wedded to the idea that children either needed to learn to read through phonics, where they learned the names of the letters and the sounds that the letters made, and use that information to read words, so decoded words by their letters and their sounds. And then in the other camp, there were folks that thought that phonics was really a bad idea and that it was taking away meaning from reading, and that children really needed to learn to read through whole language, where you read a lot of books, you talk about the books, you have children memorize lists of sight words. So we realized after the 80s and the 90s were over, research proved that neither approach is the only one that should be used, that for a child to become a proficient reader, they need both. Because if you think about the way that adults read, we use both, right? When you come to a word that you don't know, you use phonics, you sound something out, you use the context of the text to figure out what that word that you sounded out meant. And then you also have a lot of words memorized. There's a lot of words that you just know how to read. It makes reading go a lot faster. It's not quite so laborious. But we use both, and both are important to the task of reading and helping children to be proficient readers. So this is something that we need to make sure that we're doing a little bit of each thing, right? We need to teach children letters, the names of the letters, the sounds the letters make, so that when they get into elementary school, they can use that information to start decoding words, putting that letter name information together with letter sound information. We also need to read to them a lot. We need to talk about books with them, help them to understand why written text is important and interesting and fun to utilize. As they're engaged in reading and doing early writing activities, they also start to learn words. They'll ask you, how do I write to? Because I want to write to mom. Or how do I write love? I want to tell my mom I love her. So they're also learning a sight word bank as well at the same time, and both are vitally important to children's later reading skills. It's important to understand that phonological awareness is an auditory skill. So this is something that children can do without knowing any of the letters. So they don't have to know that an A is an A or a B is a B. They don't have to know what sounds those letters make. They don't have to know that letters work together to make words that are able to be read. This is literally just something that is an auditory skill. So when children listen to people speak, when they listen to stories being read, they hear the sounds of language. They hear the sounds that are in words. So if I read to you the word ball, you don't have to know the letters B-A-L-L. You don't have to know that the letter B makes a B sound, but you still hear the sound B when I read the word ball to you. So at the beginning, it's really important for children just to be able to hear the sounds of language, to play rhyming games, to have books read to them with different sound play involved. As they're listening, they start to hear the syllables in words. They start to hear that words have different beginning and end sounds. And that skill, that phonological awareness, auditory hearing skill, is something that they're going to be able to use later when they start to learn the names of the letters. So if you look on the slides, you'll see that print principles and phonemic awareness are next. That's because children have to learn the auditory skill first, and then they start working on learning what letters look like, what the names of those letters are, what sounds they make. Then they can use that information to start putting together letters and their sounds to make words. This is just an additional slide looking at some of the skills that children need to be able to be ready to read. So on the previous slide, you notice that there is some overlap between the things that were there, so things like vocabulary and phonological awareness and letter knowledge. But you'll also see that there are narrative skills, so being able to tell a story. So this, again, it's just additional information on the kinds of skills that we can be working on in the early childhood period that are considered to be early literacy skills. So these are all the things we're working on before a child actually sits down and is ready to read. On the next few slides, we'll talk about what children's reading skills are. So the first two slides are looking at information from the California Learning Foundation. So on this slide, we'll cover milestones related to interest in print. On the next slide, we'll cover milestones related to alphabet and print recognition. And then I did want to give you a slide that talks a little bit about what we expect in early elementary school, which is kind of out of the developmental period for this class, but I really wanted to show you that we're really focusing on these early literacy skills in the preschool period, and the actual reading doesn't really come until elementary school. Same with writing. The actual writing doesn't really come until elementary school. So with regard to preschoolers and interest in print, so you can see that 3-year-olds like books. They either go get books on their own to read, or they bring a book over to an adult to read to them. They're very good at listening to stories. They can ask questions about the book that's being read. They talk about things that are in the book. Again, they look at books on their own, so definitely that interest in print is there. At 4, children really love literacy and literacy-related activities. I know for my own children that the worst thing that I could tell them when they were small was that we weren't going to read a story for bedtime, because they loved it that much, because books were so important and so pleasurable. Nothing better than sitting on an adult's lap or snuggling up close and listening to a story. Because they are now even more familiar with books, particularly a book that you've read a fair amount to them, they should know who the main characters in the story are. If it's a familiar story, they should be able to ask questions about the story. They should be able to retell a story to someone else, reenact it in their dramatic play, reproduce things that were in the story in their artwork. So definitely a higher level of engagement and comprehension in the books that are being read to them or that they're looking at on their own. They should know that print carries meaning. So they realize that you're not just reading about the pictures, that those lines, those words on the page mean something, and that when you're reading to them, that's what you're reading. So they are aware that there's more to a story than just pictures. By age 5, they are doing even more independent literacy related activities, so more independent book reading. And take reading lightly. It could just be looking at the pictures or retelling a familiar story. It doesn't mean that they're actually reading the words yet. They should demonstrate knowledge of details. Again, so we see kind of that same thing that we saw at age 4, but not just main characters or events, but some of those finer details that are in a story. And then again, you see the same thing, recognizing print conventions and understanding that print carries specific meaning, not just meaning, but more specific meaning at this point. So with regard to alphabet and print recognition, you see that there isn't anything for age 3 because the infant toddler learning foundations don't have anything related to this particular milestone, but you can see at age 4 that children recognize the first letter of their own name. They can match some letter names to their printed form. So if they see a letter, they can say, oh, that's a T. Honestly, if 4-year-olds if 4-year-olds have a lot of exposure to letters and the letters in their name, they probably will recognize even more than this. Preschoolers are pretty attentive to letter information depending on how much information you present them with. So having name tags on the children, having name tags on their cubbies, putting name tags out to find your place to sit at snack or for circle time. Those are all ways that we can help children to start recognizing those letters and recognizing the letters in their own name. By age 5, they should definitely recognize their whole own name, not just the first letter, some other common words that they see in print. Being able to match more than half of the uppercase letters and half of the lowercase letters to their printed form. So being able to say that's a big A, that's a little a, and also being able to recognize that letters have sounds. So knowing that A says ah. And this is great to come back to when we were talking about zoophonics on one of the previous slides. This is a great way to help children recognize that letters have sounds. So like I said, I also wanted to give you a little information about reading skills in early elementary school. So once children get about 6 or 7, then these kinds of skills should be coming into play. So being able to use both phonics and sight word skills. So phonics, again, are matching letters to their sounds. So looking at the word cat and being able to identify that it has the letter C-A-T, that those letters say k, a, t, and then reading that word cat. Or also using sight word skills. So now some words are memorized, like the and from and love, and then they can use those sight words to be able to read. So reading when you get into elementary school is a combination of using phonics and sight word skills. The other thing that children are able to do more effectively is to use what's called informational text. So this would be what we would consider to be like a textbook or nonfiction. When we are talking about younger children, we call them information books or information text because it is a book or text that gives information about something. And so mostly children at this age are learning to read rather than reading to learn. They are starting to be able to use information text in kind of a minimal way. And then as their reading skills continue to get better and they're working less on the process of learning to read, then they can read these information texts more to learn. Just like with reading, there are skills that children need to eventually be able to officially engage in writing activities. So these skills would be considered to be those pre-literacy skills. So we talked already about the pre-literacy skills related to reading. So phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, print knowledge, those kinds of things. But they also need some pre-literacy skills that we can work on developing in the early childhood period. And those those skills are first fine motor skills, and I'm going to hang on to that because you'll see the graphic on the next slide that will show you the fine motor skills that children are going to need to be working on so that eventually they can become good writers. But they also need visual perception skills, so they need to understand that directionality matters. So when we're creating words, we don't put letters out of order. We put letters in the correct order. We put them from left to right. We put words on the page from top to bottom and left to right. So it's important for children to understand that the direction of letters going together to make a word and the direction of words coming together to make sentences is important. Now, I do want to distinguish this from the last bullet on this slide, constancy of letter position, because a lot of times students get those two concepts confused. So directionality is making sure that letters get put together in a particular order to make an actual word, or that words get put together in a particular order to make an actual sentence. But constancy of letter position is specifically focusing on the letter itself. It doesn't have to be related to a word or a sentence. This is just the letter, that if a letter is going to be a particular letter, it has to be written in a particular way. So we know for the lowercase d and b, it matters if those get written backwards. So if you write a B backwards, it is a D. And if you write a lowercase d backwards, it becomes a lowercase b. So that's more about individual letters rather than the directionality that's associated with words and sentences. Children also need to understand that words need to have spaces around them, that you can't just string a whole bunch of letters together and have that be a word or a sentence. There need to be little breaks in between so that we can see what word goes with what thing. I already kind of mentioned this, but the arrangement of words on a page. So in English, we go from top to bottom and left to right. So these are all things that we don't necessarily need to directly teach young children, but if we give them exposure to letters and words and sentences and written text, these are skills that they will acquire so that when they are ready to start writing, they've already got some of that basic structure of writing in place. So as I said on the previous slide, these are the fine motor skills that children need to be able to eventually write. So the beautiful thing about all of these fine motor skills is that you don't need to do actual writing activities to get these kinds of fine motor skills. There's all kinds of fabulous fine motor activities that you can do. If you eventually take the preschool curriculum class with me, the 2262, I do provide a lecture on fine motor activities that you can do to build these kinds of skills, but you can also look online for fine motor activities. But these are the fine motor skills that we need to be working on. So getting hand and finger strength, being able to cross at midline, so being able to have an object in one hand and then cross over to the other hand to be able to manipulate that object, how to hold a pencil or a writing instrument. Children generally start with kind of a whole hand grasp, and then they work their way towards a more adult-like grasp using the thumb and the forefinger. Having high hand-eye coordination. I don't have mouth coordination, but they need to have hand-eye coordination. Bilateral integration, so this goes along with that crossing at midline, being able to use two hands to perform a task. They need to have upper body strength, because when we have upper body strength, then our wrists and hands and fingers work better in addition. Being able to manipulate objects, button buttons, and tie shoes, and brush your hair, and brush your teeth, and use utensils. That would all be object manipulation. Being able to see things, to visually perceive them, which I know may not sound like a fine motor skill, but remember that our eyes are part of that fine motor system, so that is important as well. Hand dominance, usually by about age 2, children have established whether they're right or left-handed. We talked about that in the motor development lecture. And then hand division, so being able to pinch something between fingers and be able to recognize that you have something in between that pinching motion. So as with reading skills, let's talk a little bit about preschool children's writing skills or pre-literacy writing skills, and then we'll also talk a little bit about elementary school, again, just to make sure that you understand developmental progression and that we don't really expect true reading and writing to happen until elementary school, but there's absolutely wonderful things that we can be doing in the pre-literacy realm for preschool age children. So we expect 3-year-olds to be making scribble marks on paper, maybe pretending to read what they've written. Now this is different than drawing skills. So with creativity, we talked about drawing skills. Reading and writing, or excuse me, drawing and writing both start with scribbles and then they dovetail out from each other. So those scribbles turn into drawings and those scribbles also turn into written letters and words. So right now we're just talking about those written letters and words. So 4-year-olds should be experimenting with holding writing utensils in different ways and ways to position their body to make writing comfortable. This is great to give them lots of practice with different kinds of writing tools, different kinds of things to write on, different kinds of surfaces, keeping things flat on the table, then also having vertical surfaces like an easel to be able to write on. It's good for them to get that kind of practice. They should be using scribbles again that are different than pictures. So we already know that those scribbles start turning into people and trees and animals, but those scribbles also turn into the letters of their name, letters that they would like to write to give to other people. So we're talking about writing, not drawing. They should make marks to represent their own name, or they should be potentially writing their own names by now. It might be all capitals at the beginning, and then it slowly shifts over to capitals and lowercase letters, but at least writing something to represent who they are. When they are about 5, they should be able to have increased control in their drawing and their writing because they're better at grasp and body position. They should be writing their first name pretty much correctly by this point in time if they weren't already, and they should also be writing some other letters to represent words or ideas, particularly words that they've seen a lot, like to, from, and I love you. Those tend to be pretty popular ones. So for early elementary school age children, the writing skills that we expect to see at this time is really actually writing words and writing short sentences. So on the next slide, you're going to see an example of something that a 6-year-old wrote. So you'll see how capable they really are in terms of their writing skills. They start off with something called transitional spelling. So at the beginning, they are really just writing the sounds that they hear. So like I gave you the example of turtle. If you really think about the word turtle, it only has the TRTL sound. Hanger only has the HANGR. So just the letters they can hear. That's the letters they're going to be writing down, and that is phonetic spelling. Semi-phonetic is when you start to add in some correctly spelled words, and then you keep using phonetic spelling for the words that are hard. So you can see turtle stays as turtle. But like my mom is nice, maybe they know how to write the word mom, they know how to write my, they know how to write is, but they're not quite sure about nice yet, so they just do their best and use that phonetic spelling. And then eventually, once they get more towards middle, early elementary school, so like 3rd-ish grade, they should start to use more conventional spelling because they've just learned more words, and they have more of a word bank to be able to use when they're writing things. So this slide has 2 things on it. One, it has that video that I was telling you about, very cute video showing a story written by a 6-year-old, and you can see a nice combination of using that transitional spelling, kind of that semi-phonetic. So there are some words that are spelled correctly, and then there are some words that are using phonetic spelling, just so you can see an example of that. And then also on this slide is just kind of stages, so you can see what I was just talking about with those developmental milestones, but you can see it written out in a different way. So you can see each one of the stages, from drawing, scribbles, making letter-like forms, letter strings, that transitional writing we were just talking about, and then the conventional spelling. And then it's nice because it gives you examples so you can see what each one of those looks like. Even though early literacy doesn't mean that children are actually reading and writing yet, the skills that they developed during those early years are critically important. So we know that when we engage in appropriately early literacy activities, that children will do better later in life. So here's some things to keep in mind. So preschoolers whose parents read to them, tell them stories, and sing songs with them tend to develop larger vocabulary, become better readers, and perform better in school. And we do know that the achievement that children have in reading by the end of 3rd grade is considered to be kind of a make it or break it moment. So if you don't really have the reading skills that you need by the end of 3rd grade, then you're going to have a hard time catching up and being able to read and write effectively later on. So it's really important for children to come into the early elementary school years with a solid foundation, and that's what early literacy does. It gives children a solid foundation so that they can take advantage of that really intensive literacy instruction, that reading and writing instruction in the early elementary school years, and then they can go forward being good readers and writers in the rest of their life. So I would encourage, and then also 83% of children who are not reading on grade level by the beginning of 4th grade are at risk of failing to graduate from high school on time. So that's what I mean by that make it or break it. So if you're coming into 4th grade and you don't have those literacy skills that you need, it's really going to put you at risk for not even graduating from high school when you're supposed to. So I would encourage you to check out both of the links on this page. They are good information about how important early literacy is and the good benefits that it provides for children. On these last 2 slides, we're talking about ways that we can facilitate literacy, or these early literacy kinds of skills. So I would encourage you to take a look at the article on this page to start with. It gives a lot of good information about the things that we're going to be talking about on this slide and the next. But just to start with, it's really important to just in general promote language development. So building children's vocabulary, talking with them a lot, using interesting words, using that child-centered but not baby talk kind of language, because children who have good vocabularies are better readers. It's one of the best predictors of how well a child will do in reading later on, is the size of the vocabulary that they come into that reading landscape with. Make sure that children understand that reading and writing is important. And this isn't something that you have to directly teach. This is something that you can model. So if you go get a recipe book when you want to make something, or you say, oh, hang on, let me look up and see how to do that, or let me write this down so that I can remember it later on, or I really miss my friend, so I'm going to write them a short note. When you show children through your day-to-day actions that reading and writing is important, then it's something that they're likely to want to engage in on their own. Play lots of games that encourage that awareness of sounds, that building of the relationship between letters and sounds. So reading books that have alliteration, brown bear, lots of B's in there. Using children's names, as I was mentioning earlier, having their names everywhere in the classroom that you can think of. Playing games, rhyming games, singing songs. So this really is meant to be hands-on and fun. It's not sitting down, doing worksheets, having direct instruction. There's plenty of time for that much later in their lives. This is about games and activities and songs and meaningful opportunities to engage with spoken language and written language. And then when children start to get a little bit older, you can start introducing some of those mechanics. So helping them to learn how to write their names, pointing out words in a book that you're reading. When you're writing something down, put a finger or two between the words to say, oh, I need to remember to make space between those words when I'm writing. So again, not direct teaching in the sense that you're sitting children down with a worksheet and making them do things, but highlighting things, pointing things out when you're engaged in these early literacy activities. Just one note in this video, when the narrator is talking about phonemic awareness, she's actually combining the ideas that we talked about earlier of phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. So she's putting them together, but I do want you to remember that phonological awareness is hearing sounds in letters, whereas phonemic awareness is learning the names of the letters and what sounds those written letters make. So just be careful that you do distinguish between phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. It's a great video other than that, but that's one thing that a distinction is not being made between those two concepts. They're being lumped together, and I want to make sure that you understand the difference.